Welcome to Varn Solo, and we're continuing our discussion of Aristotle, and we're going to finish it today. I've gone over how Aristotle's categories of knowing, with the abstract unmoving being the most true, and politics being an emanation of that, very much is influential. That his breaking down of things in techne and whatnot really affected things. His six and maybe seven types of government. There is an argument that there are actually three types of democracies mentioned. And then when we get to kingships and constitutions, he mentions five specific types of kingships that are all valid. We'll come back to that. The reason why I mentioned that there might be democracy, or which is also called polity, which is based off the Constitution of Solon, where there are classes, but classes are defined by your ability to pay into certain tax brackets, and there are roles, and there's roles for everyone in government, etc., etc. So there is a discussion of whether or not democracy and then another form of polity are actually two separate things. And democracy constrained by law and democracy unconstrained by law, both of which would be bad for Aristotle, but nonetheless, that is an argument that I've seen made. So we've spoken about this. We've gone into the importance of the polis and why Aristotle thought that politics was a natural extension of man's teleology, telos being very clearly reasoning for Aristotle, since he considered that to be something that you could see in man's ability to talk, and man was unique in this. And thus man was a political animal, because politics enables you to reason for the good of all beings, being the expression of the place where public reasoning actually is made manifest in the world. We also talked about how he thought that these things develop from households to villages, from villages into polises, and then that polises are defined by the metropoles and are not really city-states like we think of them exactly, because they have deans and colonies. So there you go. There's a lot more we talked about too, but I just wanted to go over it with you. We also talked about Aristotle's rejection of some of the stranger things in the Republic, as well as in Plato's Laws. He also seemed to be motivated by rejecting democracy for three reasons that are not immediately obvious when you just think about what democracy is. One, he seems to think that pure democracy leads to unstable laws. Two, he thinks it has a tendency to overprivilege the executive because of the chaos of the situation, and thus individual bad actors such as Alcibiades and maybe even Pericles can take over the government and act as de facto tyrants without the responsibilities or constraints of tyrants. And this seems to be part of his defense of Socrates in a way, that Socrates was charged with corrupting the youth, and the youth specifically that is generally associated with this is not the other philosophers, it's Alcibiades. If you don't know the story of Alcibiades, I would suggest you look it up. But Alcibiades basically tried to take over the Republic and was in turn traitor. Coriolanus is a similar figure if you know your Shakespeare. So that's the problem with democracy too, is that it actually, ironically for Aristotle, ends up being tyrannical through demagoguery. And it makes laws unstable, thus rule of law is hard to enforce. And then lastly, it is not part of his virtuous moderate way. And we'll get to that because this is also something Aristotle does. So let's go over the types of kingship, and maybe we can get to these problems with democracy. One, there are at least um, 5 kinds of kingship mentioned in uh, the politics, most of which have to do with the study of the Constitution. One, there's the heroic kingship, where the king is a warrior priest and a judge that is willingly accepted by the people in informal, often tribal circumstances. He's just the most useful dude, and people go to him to arbitrate decisions, and he thus becomes king, and the Constitution establishes out of that. There's also two what he calls barbarian monarchy, usually found in the Near East or in Central Asia, which is hereditary despotisms, but that are bound by law and custom. He would consider this probably given towards tyranny, but at least there is law and custom constraining the monarch. Then he talks about elective tyranny, which is when the people of like Molini elected the philosopher Pittacus to govern them, and elected tyranny is where you elect an absolute ruler. It's kind of like Caesarism is for the early modern period. Then he talks about Spartan kingship, which was a dual kingship of Sparta. Although Sparta kind of Aristotle kind of dismisses Sparta here and says that it is simply a hereditary generalship held for life. Later on, Aristotelians, not Aristotle himself, would actually compare the Spartan kingship with the dual Roman consulship in the Middle Age Republic. Then there is the absolute kingship, which is Basileia, I think, which is control of the people in all aspects. This is generally considered a form of tyranny unless the absolute king is absolutely virtuous, then it would be good. I mean, this is Aristotle's way of thinking. The form is actually not as important as the content for Aristotle, and this is something that a lot of people don't entirely catch when they first read him. So Aristotle's pupil Alexander the Great is often given by later commentators, not again Aristotle himself, as being an example of this. But this is an absolute king, unconstrained by any will but his own, and thus the morality of the king is also unconstrained in either direction. So we talked about the ironies of democracy, and I think Thucydides talks about this quite clearly when talking about Pericles. I mean, Thucydides says, "Thus Athens, in the name of the act of democracy, was ruled by its greatest citizen." And this actually comes up in Plato. And Plato's Statesman. And in Plato's Statesman, we also see this division that we have in Aristotle. So Aristotle didn't totally come up with it. Now, Plato wrote a lot about politics. People tend to focus on the Republic because it's weird. And I think esoteric, actually. I think there's hidden meanings in it. But there are other places where Plato talks about politics. Both the Laws and the Statesman are among them, and people don't read those generally. All right. So I'm just going to read something that I got from an article by Eugenia Russell about Plato's division here. So this is just from the Statesman 302 C through D in the classical section annotation. Okay, stranger. Well, then you may see that there are 3 forms, that is both the same of the hardest and the easiest. Young Socrates, what do you mean? Stranger, that there are 3 forms of government, just like we said at the beginning of the discussion, which has now flowed upon us. Monarchy, the rule of the few, and the rule of the many. Yes, there are those 3. Stranger, let us then, by dividing the 3 into 2 parts, make 6, by distinguishing the right government from these a seventh. This is also where the seventh category comes in. Um, young Socrates, how shall we make the division? Stranger, we said that monarchy comprised of royalty and tyranny. We said the rule of the few comprised of aristocracy, which is the name of a good omen, and oligarchy, which is the name of the many. We have given only a single name. Democracy now, too, and that must be divided. Well, how in principle shall we divide that? All right. So you can see here that there's this division that Aristotle seeks to find in the actual constitutions, in his kind of attempt to build a political science as opposed to just a normative philosophy. And this makes him different from Plato, and he critiques Plato a good bit. But we see here that his divisions are actually found in Plato, and a Plato that we don't read a lot of, but still a Plato piece. We also know that the polity is something that we see in specific reference to Solon of Athens. Now, one of these weird things that we have to deal with when we're trying to understand Aristotle is Aristotle treats political science as discrete, or political episte, but he does not really mean what we mean by it today. When he talks about the middle classes, yeah, merchants are kind of part of that, but he's also talking about landholders and mostly military people. He is not talking about labor aristocratic capitalist workers or capitalist petit bourgeois. Although many people today read him as that because they naturalize these concepts back in time. And it is interesting, if you read a lot of Aristotle on trade, how much of it shows up in Adam Smith, and that's how much of it shows up in the Critique of Political Economy in Karl Marx. I mean, there's whole footnotes and sections that really have to deal with Aristotle. You cannot deal with Marx without dealing with Aristotle to some degree. But it does make sense why Aristotle is used as almost a ventriloquist dummy for most modern liberal conceptions of history. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, he favored the middle class because he favored the virtuous mean. And the middle classes were the classes of like yeomen and independent farmers and people in the middle of the Solonian constitutional system. And for him, this is because there were virtues of excess and virtues of deficiency, or maybe what we call vices of excess and vices of deficiency, which, think about what Aristotle says in the Nicomachean Ethics. Courage is a virtuous mean. Cowardice is a deficiency of courage, and rashness is an excess of courage. All right, but they're both problems. So favoring the most elite classes solely and favoring the lower classes solely models this way of thinking. Aristotle, like Plato, for all of his critiques of Platonic forms and all this, that, and the other, he seemed to think in terms of geometric parsimony, meaning that categories and stuff were relatively geometric and relatively equal. That's how he thought. And these categories in one thing influence the other, because remember, the ultimate truth is the unmoved abstract. Then there's the more true things like math, which is the moving abstract, which can be counted. And then there is, the everyday world of empirical observation, which is the lowest form of philosophy since it's the most variable. Now, you add all this together and you get a weird conception that like Aristotle is pointing to something like the Roman Republic, and later Aristotelians would even, and people influenced by Aristotle would even argue this, partly because the Romans were in charge of Greece at this time. But when you think about it, it's also why these were often used in the early modern period till, basically the full development of capitalism in the 19th century, as a way of understanding proper roles of government. And so Aristotle has always been important. He's important in the medieval mind too, but they focus on his writings about kings a lot more than they focus on his writings about democracy or oligarchy. Now, we have to remember also that Aristotle did think these things worked for different sizes of government. Like a very large polity would probably be better ruled by a king, it seems like, for Aristotle, and like a smallish Polish would be very easily a polity and thus democratic. And you can see that there's a lot. He is actually thinking about things like geographic limitations, size limitations of the polity, etc., changing what would be the ideal form. But he basically thinks there is an ideal form in all the three possible types of government. Rule by one, rule by many, rule by all. And if you look at the way he breaks this down, there's a functional form and a non-functional form, but the functional form follows the mean, which can enforce the norms, which can allow for people to be virtuous, and thus in being virtuous can act politically and prove their reason, and thus in being reasonable prove their part in the natural order as emanated from the unmoved mover. And if you don't know what I'm talking about the unmoved mover, Aristotle was not a monotheist exactly, but he did sort of believe that there was one singular principle of which does not change and does not move, of which all other truth is relative to, and it emanates truth from it. There's a lot of Platonic stuff that this rhymes with, particularly Neoplatonic, but if it also sounds like maybe a little bit Gnostic to you, there's a reason. And this idea seems to have been developing in the ancient world around the time of the development of Christianity, and concurrent with the development of Judaism into a monotheistic religion. And I say development of Judaism into a monotheistic religion because most scholars do believe that early Judaism was at best acknowledged the existence of many gods and only worshipped one, and maybe even wasn't even that coherent from the standpoint of monotheism. I mean, after all, the plural singular form of God is a little weird by the construction of even most biblical Hebrew grammar. But nonetheless, it's something to keep in mind as you read this. So, we have this focus in Aristotle on the mean. We have these systems of government, which he got from Plato. We have the fact that he also doesn't think that it's just as simple as a binary yes, no. So not only do you have these mixed form constitutions with clear classes, with clear roles, which is what he likes for a functioning polity, aka a functioning democracy or republic, we also have the constrained and unconstrained by law democracies, and what that would mean as well. Those for Aristotle are often mentioned together, but they really are, as pointed out, two separate forms of government. But we can also see why Aristotle would be more than a lot of other ancient stakers like Proclus or ancient historians like Copius. I think I got that right. I always flip those two. Or the weirdness of Plato and trying to figure out all of Plato's allegories and this, that, and the other, and particularly in the Republic, what we're supposed to take as literal and what we're not. We can see a wide range of things here, but there's a couple of things that we have to look at in regards to what Aristotle thinks government is for, and we talked about in the beginning. It is to create a virtuous society, because in a virtuous society, human beings can reason. They can reason by participating in politics, because it is where you discourse, is where you prove your reason. Discourse is possible in a political community, but Aristotle thinks most people necessarily are shut out of that. And even like the biggest Athenian democracies still shut out the majority of the population from participating. After all, women, minorities, and slaves are not involved, nor are resident foreigners. I believe in most cases. I'm not 100% sure that was always the case. But anyway, we can see this, and we can see that in some ways it seems like Aristotle's talking about our world, but in many ways he's absolutely not. And it seems like his way of thinking is related to ours because it's super influential on ours. But again, if we actually look at the way he thinks of categories, truths, in his epistemology, which does undergird his political thinking, we can see that it doesn't really look like modern liberalism either, but could easily be confused for it. And on that note, thus is the father of modern political science in the West, anyway. I am going to be beginning a series on third worldism and the various theories and where they came from. And I'm going to try to be as factual in that as I am in this as well. So we're going to take a break. I think I may cover Plato. I'm just a little scared about how overwhelming it's going to be because Aristotle's political thinking is clearly delineated, tied up in about 3 key texts, the 2 ethics and the politics, and is fairly systemic and thus easy to understand. Plato's is in at least 3 dialogues, at least one of which is highly allegorical and esoteric, the Republic. The interpretations of what they mean are all over the place, and the people who base it off of Socrates have to deal with the fact that the political thought of Socrates, according to Xenophon, and the political thought of Socrates, according to Plato, don't mix. So it's a much messier time. I'm fascinated with it, and I then have to get into other historical anecdotes like what the hell was Plato doing with Alcibiades? And why does that become so historically important? But maybe it'll be fun. I'm also thinking about doing a series on the political thought of early Confucius, but that one's harder to do because Confucianism as an ideological set develops over, to its classical form over about 1,000 years. Some of the early texts are extremely early, but they're also read in light of later text. This is also true for the Taoist political text, and so much that there are Taoist political texts. And I'm not a specialist in ancient Chinese. I don't even read Mandarin. So I've read a bunch of books of Confucianism. I've read books on legalism and Moism and some other Chinese ways of thinking. I don't feel particularly competent on all of it. I can explain Buddhist political thinking in Southeast Asia a lot better, but it's not that relevant to as many people. It's not even that relevant to like what goes on in India now. So going off on that would be kind of a waste of time. But I'm thinking about doing Confucianism. So what we're going to do is we're going to start a series called 13 Ways of Looking at a Third World Division, where I talk about the various theories of third worldism. And then probably in the middle of covering 1 or 2 of those and a little bit of the history of the different things that have called themselves third worldism, I'll go back and do another ancient political figure. I'm going to be doing this for a while. I got a lot of people to get through. And, I got to get through the Stoics' thought on politics. I got to get through the Epicurean. I need to get through, I want to at least get to early modern Machiavelli before I give out. And that's a lot because I want to go into the pre-liberal forms of understanding liberty, constitutionalism, and all that, and what politics is to the ancients, because it isn't really the same as what it is for us. But it's also not completely different, as in many such things that use similar words. So it's going to be kind of a long slog. And I want to cover things like more traditional socialist topics and go through them relatively concretely. This third worldism is like a roundabout way of me getting into the various socialist theories of imperialism, which is a project I dread because most critics of imperialism think they're talking about the same thing, and when you really pull the strings, they're not, and it's a long slog. And I promised 5 years ago that I would eventually do it, and I gave up. And for those of you who don't know, this is all for a book I'm writing with L. Smith on what politics is and what class politics is, etc., and how to clarify those terms. And it's something called barbarians, which is like a triple pun. It's both it's both related to Bradiga. It's me talking about the destruction of Wongtopian thinking, but it's actually increasingly just me talking about unclarities of words and thinking. So we'll see how it goes. But there's a whole section on early modern and ancient forms of what the political is, and so hence I'm actually sharing my research with you. So we'll see how it all goes. I'd like to thank you for your time. You can like and subscribe, hit the bell. There's a Patreon. You can get access to the audio for as little as $4 a month. Also, I'd love if you shared this or commented, because we've gotten to about 7,000 viewers because I'm not monetizing this. I'm not prioritizing the algorithm. That really is something when you choose not to be monetized, you actually are explicitly discriminated against in the algorithm. That's one thing I'm 100% sure of. So I need more word of mouth distribution. And if you get it for me, I'd be grateful. I am actually considering monetizing, not for the money, but for the spread. But there's still probably more reasons not to, including the fact that you're under more scrutiny of what you say, and advertisers are more pissy. And I don't have to be worried about demonetizing, deprioritized when I was never prioritized or monetized in the first place. But, we can see. Patreon's doing fine. The free show is readily available, so I'm not gonna complain. But I don't have a production staff, so I'm never gonna be hitting like those shows that are like little mini documentaries. Because I don't have time to build those. Although if I did, I'm sure, as I did once with working with Stephen Mikhalkov over at Former People, the one time we had something go viral on a channel that's even smaller than this one, went viral hugely because we actually did do, or actually Stephen mostly did, I just did some voiceover parts, a video essay with all the cuts and whatnot. Anyway, like and subscribe, hit the bell. I have a Substack. I don't really update it that much, but if you want to find it, it's at Varn blog on Substack. I'm so original. And I used to like really think hard about naming blogs. Symptomatic Redness. And I was going to name one The Devil Wears Pravda, but I thought maybe that was too obscure of a joke. But nonetheless, all right, you can find me on Varn blog. You can find me on most podcast aggregates for the interview show on Varn blog. Dear God, let's hope you don't speak Mexican Spanish, where B and B are the same. And you can find us here. Like and subscribe, protect your peace, and go study the ancients. It's good for you. I'm gonna one day try to figure out if I can get into like ancient Mesoamerican politics or something, but the 3 sources on that are kind of the only 3 sources I have. So we'll see. Take care.